Welcome, Tapirs. You might have met me already through a couple of our welcome sessions and talks. I'm Anshuman. I'm the founder and CEO of Terra and also the course director for LFA. And it's my pleasure and privilege to invite Dr. Chip Fletcher for his guest talk today. Chip has been an old dear friend of the company, has been giving an incredible talk for the past some years now to cohorts coming into Terra. And he has a very short bio that I'm going to read out right now so that we can get into it immediately. But before I do that, just in terms of logistics, if you have questions as Chip is presenting, please type them in the chat. And once the talk is over, we'll have some minutes to go through those questions, and we will start picking them up from chat. With that, I welcome Dr. Charles Chip Fletcher, who is the Dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's also the former chair of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. And with that, Chip, over to you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see the first slide? Great. Yeah, go ahead.
We're seeing the web page.
Missing the what?
So we're seeing the web page of Earth at Risk.
Yes, you should be. It's a screen grab.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's the first slide. So this is a paper that I published last year, and it discusses not only climate change, but biodiversity loss, social inequality, pollution, disease as 5 global simultaneous crises that I refer to as a global polycrisis. This term is gaining more and more traction. I think it might have a wiki page now. The purpose of the paper is to draw attention to how these 5 crises overlap and interact with each other and, in fact, amplify each other. Let me hide the video panel and the floating controls. So we are going to start out with a discussion of climate change. We'll get into a discussion of global energy and greenhouse gas emissions, and then we will touch on these additional global crises. And what you're looking at here is the history of carbon dioxide emissions measured here at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii beginning in the late 1950s. There are a couple of dozen other observatories around the world. The reason that this one is located in Hawaii is because the trade winds blow across 4,000 miles of open ocean. And so it's one of the locations on the planet where you get the cleanest air, the best sampling of actual atmospheric chemistry without a city or a greenhouse source upstream. This record in the early days showed a CO2 growth in the atmosphere of less than 1 part per million per year, but more recently over 2 parts per million per year. So CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere at an accelerating rate. Last year, the rate of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere rose 86% above the previous year. This is the fastest in recorded history. And so despite 2 decades of attempts to slow down our greenhouse gas emissions, the rate of CO2 buildup in the air is actually accelerating. Here's the NASA record of surface annual temperature. The US Space Agency, NASA, collects temperature records from the ocean surface and the land surface, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and every black square is a single average annual mean temperature. You can see that some years are warmer and some years are cooler. Typically, these cooler years are La Nina years and the warmer years are El Nino years. And the most recent temperature records here in the last 2 years broke the United Nations goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius We have now warmed the atmosphere 1.6 degrees Celsius, but notice that there's high variability. And so next year, 2025, I should say this year, and next year, 2026, 2027, we're likely to see a decline in the temperature back down below 1.5 and then up again until finally it permanently breaks through the 1.5, which is anticipated to be sometime in the early 2030s, early in the next decade. Take note that natural environments are exquisitely sensitive to even small increases in mean temperature. Even a modest rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average air temperature has caused dramatic shifts. Coral reefs bleach, glacial ice melts, growing seasons have changed, disease vectors have expanded, and weather has grown more extreme. A good analogy for a sensitive system is our own metabolism. If we experience an increase in our body temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're running a low to medium grade fever. And chances are we don't go to work that day. We feel very poorly. And if this increases for 2 to 3 to 4 days and continues, we begin to experience some severe long-term effects and need to get ourselves to the hospital or to the doctor as soon as possible. So small changes in temperature can have huge impacts on natural systems. Understanding the sensitivity is crucial to understanding the gravity of our warming trajectory. Here is a map showing temperature change relative to the global average, and it tells us several things. The continents are far hotter than the average warming, and the oceans are still cooler than the average warming. And so this is leading to continental heat waves, continental drying, Arctic amplification. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the average of the planet. And because the Arctic is warming so fast and the tropics are warming slower, the temperature difference across a hemisphere between the tropics and the Arctic is reduced. And therefore, the temperature gradient, which drives atmospheric circulation, is becoming more sluggish. And as heat from the tropics is transferred towards the poles, it tends in the northern hemisphere to turn to the right because of the spin of the Earth, and this becomes the jet stream. We actually have 4 jet streams, but the northernmost jet stream has developed large meanders so that a downward meander in the jet stream pulls Arctic air down into the temperate areas, causing billion-dollar extreme weather losses. And a meander in the jet stream towards the poles pulls tropical air up, causing prolonged, lingering heat waves. And this is one of the fundamental drivers of extreme weather, is the destabilization of the jet stream because the Arctic is warming so much faster than the rest of the planet. We are melting snow and ice, which is one of the drivers of sea level rise. Extreme weather is on the rise, global drought is on the rise, and the oceans are absorbing heat from the air as quickly as possible, which of course causes thermal expansion of the oceans. And that's the dominant driver of global sea level rise. Now, the oceans have a very complex circulation system, and warming of surface water gets circulated down into the abyss. Warm surface water circulates into the deep sea, and the whole time is causing thermal expansion. And you can see this blue current is running in the very deep ocean. And it takes a journey of over 2,000 years through the Indian Ocean, through the Southern Ocean, and up through the Pacific Ocean until it rises around Hawaii in the North Pacific Ocean. And that journey takes over 2,000 years. and the entire way it is causing thermal expansion. The consequence of this then is that sea level rise is essentially unstoppable, and we're going to be seeing sea level rise for millennia because of this circulation of thermally expanding warm water. In fact, the IPCC report a few years ago tells us that sea level is committed to rise for centuries to millennia due to continuing deep ocean warming and ice sheet melting, and will remain elevated for thousands of years. And the hundreds of scientists had to agree to every word in this sentence in order to assign it high confidence, their highest statement of confidence. So sea level rise is a major problem now because most of the world's major cities are located on the coastline, having first developed when shipping was the predominant economic activity. It is an unstoppable reality. Now, with regard to warm or extreme weather, we can characterize in the blue line the typical distribution of temperatures over the course of a year. And you have cold temperatures shown to the right side, and you have warm temperatures shown to the left side. And as you get out to 2 standard deviations or 4 standard deviations, you start having extremely rare but very intensive temperature events. These are called temperature anomalies. And if you shift the mean temperature, as we have done, we have shifted from a pre-industrial mean temperature, which we will call 0 as a baseline. We've shifted 1.5 degrees Celsius at this point. Notice the increase in the extreme anomalies. This means that the occurrence of warm temperature extremes is increasing in a nonlinear manner. And we're going to see an equally strong decrease in the cold temperature extremes. And so warmth now is a major characteristic of extreme weather. The rise in billion-dollar disasters has been very persistent throughout the last 45 years. Since 1980, the US has suffered over $400 billion weather disasters that claimed 17,000 lives and caused about $3 trillion in direct costs. The average length of time between billion-dollar disasters used to be 82 days, and it's now only 19 days. So there are more of them occurring with greater frequency, and they tend to be more extreme as well. The US saw more than $100 billion in losses last year from severe storms and fires, I should say this year in the first half of 2025. This was a record. Now, unfortunately, under the current federal administration, we're no longer collecting this data. But you'll see at the bottom of the slide, Climate Central. This is a private organization that is continuing to collect this data while the government is under its current leadership. Hopefully, we'll see a change in leadership so that important climate data like this can continue to be collected. Of course, you should be familiar that the United Nations has an office set up called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. They hold annual meetings called COPs. And just before each annual COP or Conference of Parties, they come out with a report called the GAP report. We'll talk about that in a second. At the annual meeting in 2015, which happened to be in Paris, the world's nations all agreed to stop global warming before allowing it to reach 2.5 degrees Celsius. That is, they agreed to stop their greenhouse gas emissions. And with this language, the Pacific Island nations walked out of the conference, saying that 2 degrees Celsius was a death sentence. They were soon joined by Australia and the United Kingdom. And in order to bring them in, new language was added to the Paris Agreement to pursue efforts to end warming before reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the rule of thumb became 1.5 to stay alive. So how is our progress in stopping warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius? On the bottom axis, we have time, and on the vertical axis, we have gigatons of CO2 emissions. A gigaton is a billion tons of CO2. And this dark line, this black line, is the history of CO2 emissions up until 2020. The peak year was in 2019. Of course, in 2020, we entered the COVID pandemic, and we had a global recession, and CO2 emissions fell 5.4%. But by 2021, we had come up with a vaccine, and governments released stimulus funding to spin back up their economies. And of course, that takes energy, and the energy at hand, the infrastructure for this energy is in the form of fossil fuels, coal burning plants, oil burning plants, etc., and liquid natural gas. So in 2021, CO2 emissions hit a new global record, and they did so again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. So we continue to see our CO2 emissions rise. Remember, they need to fall in order to stop warming, and this is the pathway they must follow. By mid-century, our emissions, any continued greenhouse gas emissions, have to be balanced by withdrawals or sequestration. Now, when you add up all of the promises of the world's nations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it puts us on a pathway to about 2.3 degrees Celsius in terms of national promises. But there's a difference between national promises and actual investments in energy infrastructure. And when you look at the actual investments and commitments that are being made to building new coal power plants and liquid natural gas, we're actually on a pathway to closer to 3 degrees Celsius. And this represents a gap between promises and policies. And I mentioned the GAP report. Last year, the GAP report came out in November, just before the COP. And that GAP report analyzes this problem. It said that to limit warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, emissions must fall 40% by the end of this decade. To limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius, they must fall 28%. But based on current commitments, emissions will only fall about 2.6%. Now, these numbers will be revised when the new GAP report comes out, which could be any day now. Net zero pledges cover about 80% of emissions, but most are hollow and lack implementing mechanisms. And limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require global emissions reductions of 9% per year. And notice that during the COVID pandemic in 2020, reductions only reached 5.4% that year. 9% is not a practical target to ask for. So basically, we're giving up on 1.5 C, and our next target is 2 degrees Celsius. Well, governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with stopping warming at 2 degrees Celsius. Why is this? Here is our history of deploying renewable energy around the world. In fact, although the rise in renewable energy looks rather slow, there has been a fairly strong commitment to building renewable energy power sources around the world. But, this is what fossil fuel energy looks like. And clean renewable energy is growing at about 1% per year. But our consumption of energy is growing at 2 to 3% per year. So even as we deploy clean energy, we're asking for more energy. And for decades now, our use of fossil energy has accounted for anywhere from 80 to 85% of global energy use. Last year in 2024, it was about 82%. There are energy successes. Renewable energy will overtake coal to become the world's top source of electricity by 2026 at the latest. Worldwide solar capacity installation more than doubled in the last 3 years. Last year, more than 90% of all new power installed globally was clean power. And more than 90% of the world's renewable power projects now deliver electricity at a cheaper cost than fossil fuel alternatives. So we are making great inroads. The problem now is we need to stop demanding more energy. Fundamentally, this demand for more energy is for charging electrical vehicles, for providing energy to AI data centers, for cooling energy. Last year, the demand for new refrigeration and air conditioning was the fastest growing energy demand in the United States. And also the developing nations of the world are building new transportation systems, new health systems, education systems, and the tools for doing this are fossil fuel tools because they are at hand. The world is growing hotter, especially on land in the summer. Let's examine this. So every year, about 90% of CO2 emissions come from burning fossil fuels, and about 10% come from land use, including deforestation and extractive agriculture. Regenerative agriculture looks at fields of soil as a storehouse of carbon. And you plant a row of cover crops right next to your food crops. The cover crops are designed to inject carbon into the soil to decrease erosion when it rains and to stop the flow of carbon out of the soil into the air where it finds oxygen and turns into CO2. If we can convert all of our agriculture around the planet to regenerative agriculture instead of extractive agriculture, we could end this problem in the course of a few decades. But we continue to engage in extractive agriculture. These sources of CO2, of these, 48% go into the air, trapping heat. About 30% are pulled out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis, and about 26% are dissolved in the ocean, causing ocean acidification. Now, unfortunately, photosynthesis is beginning to hit a thermal limit, and it's beginning to experience irreversible damage. Let's look at this. Plant photosynthesis removes CO2 from the air. It's an extremely important partner to stopping global warming. But plants also respire. And when they respire, they release CO2 and water vapor. Photosynthesis has a heat limit. And as the temperature passes the heat limit for different plants, photosynthesis sharply declines and experiences damage, and respiration rapidly increases. This is known, unfortunately, as leaf death. In tropical species, photosynthesis starts to decline at about 31 degrees Celsius, and it experiences irreversible losses at about 40 degrees Celsius. With continued emissions, carbon uptake by land plants will be degraded by half in just 15 years. And this effect is not accounted for by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Here's a series of papers that are published in the scientific literature. This particular one says that numerous studies suggest that a variety of ecosystems are now operating at or near their thermal thresholds. Very simply, it's getting too hot for nature to absorb carbon. And in fact, sure enough, in 2023, the amount of carbon absorbed by land temporarily collapsed. Forest, plants, and soil as a net category absorbed almost no carbon. A major factor in this was the spread of wildfire, which of course releases carbon to the air. This is one of the planetary scale issues that very few people are aware of. We are destroying photosynthesis, the same photosynthesis that feeds us and sustains us. Here's the United States, and this dark purple area is the Central Valley of California. It generates 25% of all food in the US. And earlier this summer, it reached 126 degrees Fahrenheit. Farm work had to stop by about 10 o'clock in the morning because it became dangerous for farm workers. And it would start up again at 5 o'clock in the evening, and they'd work through the night. This separates families, and it has a social justice issue because the majority of farm workers are migrant workers, and they bring their families with them. It also has a strong human health component. Working in the heat like this is extremely unhealthy. And the plants themselves experience severe degradation, and you lose portions of the crop as they bake in the heat. So we're seeing the beginnings of our food system experience the negative effects of heat. Look at India. In April of this year, a temperature of 45 degrees Celsius, almost the entire nation outside of the Himalayas. India will be among the first places where temperatures will cross survivability limits. A single day of an India-wide heat wave leads to an estimated 3,400 deaths nationally, and a 5-day heat wave leads to approximately 30,000 fatalities. We're also experiencing heat waves in the ocean. These are called marine heat waves, and since 1982, they have increased from 36 days per year to 120 days per year. And of course, a marine heat wave destroys the marine ecosystem. It destroys locations where humans get their food. This adds to the pollution of the oceans, which is also damaging ecosystems and our food sources. Now, we're looking at a map that was published in 2020 in the US Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a very prestigious journal. And this paper was called The Future of the Human Climate Niche. Niche means a corner or a small portion of the climate. Today, less than 1% of Earth's land surface is too hot for human existence. And it is these black areas in the central Sahara Desert or along the shores of the Red Sea. Now, as temperature reaches 2.7 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial background, which is slated to occur or modeled to occur in 40 to 50 years, these areas expand to 1/5 of Earth's land surface. Everything in the dark brown is a statistically significant model result. All of Southeast Asia, Northern Australia, India, the Middle East, North Africa, Central America, and huge portions of South America. In fact, today, for every additional 1 degree Celsius of warming, we can expect 1 billion people to be displaced. This displacement takes place in the form of a lack of food and water security and extreme weather events, so that communities can no longer survive where they have historically been located. They start to move. And when communities go on the move, there tends to be a rise in crime and conflict. Eventually, a community that is on the move comes up against a political border, and a host nation is faced with a choice. Do we allow this community to come into our nation or into our province and attempt to assimilate them? Or do we harden the border and prevent them from coming in? And unfortunately, what we have seen time and time again is the development of authoritarian political figures who run on a political platform declaring that we must militarize the border or seal the border because those people are coming in to take our resources, to take our jobs. They look different. They sound different. They don't speak our language. Now, there are examples of nations opening their borders. And for instance, Germany opened its border to Syrian refugees about 10 to 15 years ago. And there are lots of published reports about how the Syrians and other Middle Eastern migrants at that time have been located across the German landscape, successfully assimilating into communities, into jobs, and that they are now a very significant and beneficial portion of Germany's economy. Over 1 million immigrants were assimilated across Germany. But then we have another example at the same time of England withdrawing from the European Union in order to allow them to close their border. Austria did the same thing. So, and a current example, of course, is the United States government, which has militarized our southern border between Mexico and the US to keep out immigrants coming up from Central America, most of whom have been displaced because of growing drought and the failure of food production in these areas. This is what a refugee camp looks like. Climate change could reduce global economic activity by up to 14% by mid-century and displace over 1 billion people as refugees by 2050. Now, those of us who live in the developed West, in the developed Northern Hemisphere, the United States, the European Union, and a few other nations, live in a wealth bubble. We are not experiencing the same level of climate change impacts as the rest of the world. Drought affected 2 billion people last year and the year before. 1/4 of all people on Earth, the vast majority of whom live in low and middle income countries. An important story that has developed recently is terrestrial water loss. Here's a paper that's titled Permanent Shifts in the Global Water Cycle. An unprecedented continental drying and shrinking freshwater availability and increasing land contributions to sea level rise. Data reveal a permanent decline in terrestrial water storage, an irreversible shift in terrestrial water sources under the present changes in climate. This is because humanity is pumping aquifers dry in order to get fresh water largely to irrigate agriculture. But once that water is used, it flows into the ocean. And now the continents contribute more fresh water to sea level rise than melting ice. Thermal expansion is the #1 cause of sea level rise, and then anthropogenic shifting of water from continents to oceans by pumping our aquifers in order to feed ourselves, and the expanding drought. Huge areas of drought are now forming. These are more consequential sources of sea level rise than melting of Greenland or melting of Antarctica. Here again is an example of humanity changing the very pillars of our planet. Over 75% of Earth's land has become persistently drier in recent decades. A UN report calls this a global existential peril. Over half of global food production will be at risk of failure within 25 years. And demand for fresh water will outstrip supply by 40% in just 4.5 years. Many people don't realize that rice, corn or maize, wheat, and soy, the 4 human cereals, experience the loss of micronutrients when there's more CO2 in the air. The plant metabolism uses that CO2 more in the form of leaf growth and stalk growth, and not in the form of seed growth. These food staples have up to 13% less protein, zinc, vitamin B, and iron. And for communities that already are experiencing insufficient food, these micronutrient losses can have a severe impact. A special case is rice. Rice is the most commonly consumed cereal on the planet. But as the air gets warmer, the wetland water that rice grows in gets warmer, and the soil that rice is rooted in gets warmer, and that warmth releases heavy metals, and rice absorbs arsenic, which is a powerful poison. It will become increasingly toxic to eat, potentially putting billions of people at risk as a carcinogen by mid-century. Let's look at wheat. Global wheat provides 20% of all human protein, but its yield every year is threatened by climate change. And by 2050, the demand for wheat is projected to increase by 60%, yet the actual yield is projected to fall by 15%. This is a recipe for food shortages, price spikes, bread riots. 1 in 11 people worldwide went hungry last year, while 1 in 3 struggled to afford a healthy diet. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution are making this worse. By mid-century, an additional 300 million people will be malnourished, and 1.5 billion women and children likely to have an iron deficiency. At the same time, we are consuming our natural resources unsustainably. This paper, published in Science, discusses the pervasive human-driven decline of life on Earth, and it points to the need for transformative change. Since 1970, per-person consumption has increased 60%, and global economic activity has grown 4 times. Much of this growth comes at the expense of the natural world, which has increasingly managed to keep up with rising demands for food, energy, timber, paper, minerals, water, and more. Since 1970, food crop production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. More than half of deforestation is to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. 50% of habitable land, 2/3 of all freshwater use is for food production. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of available land surface on Earth, 16% of all available fresh water. 1/3 of worldwide grain production goes to feed cows. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than plant-based food, largely because we feed cattle corn. But cattle are grazers, they are grass eaters. And by feeding them corn, we fatten them up very rapidly and then typically slaughter them at only 2 years of age. During the course of this, their digestive system is producing methane. And satellites can detect where you have large herds of cattle because of a spike in methane over their location. In 2024, last year, for the first time since record keeping began, wildfire, not just agriculture, was the leading cause of rainforest loss, accounting for nearly half of all destruction. So agriculture has been destroying rainforest, and now we're layering on wildfire, even as agriculture continues to grow. A critical narrative here is about the stealing of indigenous lands. Over the past 5 centuries, European powers seized millions of acres from indigenous people across the globe. During decolonization over the last 2 centuries, these land grabs were never reversed, but the land went into the hands of newly created governments in all parts of the world. These nations, in order to generate revenue, then sold the rights for logging, mineral extraction, agriculture, and development. The result is deforestation, indigenous erasure, soil erosion, watershed pollution, and biodiversity loss. About 50% of the world's original forests have now been eliminated. 86% of all land mammals are either cows or humans. 70% of all birds are chickens. Human overconsumption, population growth, and intensive farming has shrunk global wildlife populations by 73%. This is linked to the spread of disease. There have been 335 new infectious diseases in the last 50 years. 75% of these are zoonotic, meaning that they jump species from animals to humans. Ebola, HIV, malaria, West Nile, anthrax, encephalitis, Zika, SARS, MERS, COVID-19, these are zoonotic pandemics. It's called a spillover event when a microbe carried by animals crosses into a human community. This occurs by habitat loss. Roughly 1/3 of all zoonotic diseases, new zoonotic diseases, are directly attributed to deforestation and habitat loss. And globally, we are still causing the net loss of 10 billion trees per year, despite all the reforestation efforts that you hear about. We also get these diseases by vector expansion. The tropics are expanding, and small mammals, mosquitoes, ticks, deer, and other carriers are moving into human communities that have never been exposed to these diseases before and have no immunity. Extreme weather events also expose humans to disease, especially at a time when human immune systems are weakened. Following an extreme weather event, there's difficulty getting clean water and food in the first couple of weeks, and that's when we see the spread of disease for months afterwards. And lastly, concentrated animal feeding operations, where we put thousands of chickens or hundreds of cows or pigs in a barn. Disease runs through this community. And every time an animal dies, we put a new living host in. This violates the natural laws of evolution. Viruses and strains of bacteria may develop increasingly fatal strains, which in nature would not have a successful life strategy. For a virus to become increasingly effective at killing its host means that that virus will go out of business. It will run out of hosts. But when you have a constant influx of living new hosts in an industrial agriculture setting, you develop strains of viruses and bacteria that have 60, 70% fatality rates. The fatality rate of COVID-19 was well under 5%. You get strains of bird flu now with 75% fatality. And of course, in keeping these animals alive, we pump them full of antibiotics, which of course leads to the spread of bacterial resistance, which is another major problem. So our food system is broken, especially in the developed nations. Disease, environmental damage, climate change, and human inequality form an amplifying feedback. Disadvantaged groups suffer disproportionately, resulting in greater inequality. The ratio between the income of the richest 10% and the poorest 10% on this planet is 25% wider than it would be in a world without global warming. Essentially, low and middle income communities are not resilient. And when an extreme weather event hits them, it drives them down, and they do not have the opportunity to climb back up again before the next extreme weather event hits them. The poorest 50% of people on this planet own just 2% of global wealth. Population growth, imperialism, which is when one community exerts its will on another, and I'm referring to the form of colonialism, slavery, indigenous erasure, this imperialism over the last several centuries, and an extractive relationship with nature have led to these emergencies. We have an economic model which grew out of colonialism, an economic model which preferences privilege and profit and does not make room for sustainability. But now, as we've seen, humanity is fundamentally changing the face of the entire planet. It's no longer a matter of going to a new location to find new resources. We are strip mining the resources from across the entirety of the planet. This, of course, has led to polluted runoff, sewage, disease, wealth disparity, impoverishment, border conflict, defaunation, deforestation, pandemics, heat waves, wildfire, extreme weather, sea level rise, coral bleaching, record floods. We must urgently redefine our relationship with nature and each other as one of reciprocity, regeneration, and social justice. We are in the midst of a sustainability transition. Yes, we are mitigating carbon emissions and we are adapting to climate hazards, but we must engage in climate resilient development where everything we do has to include mitigation and adaptation, and we must do it first and foremost for the low and middle income members of our community. We must do this development through the lens of social equity. This means focusing on public health is a climate action, affordable housing, public education, preserving water resources, ending overconsumption, driving down disease, walking away from biodiversity loss and pollution. These are all part of the sustainability transition. All 5 of these emergencies must be dealt with simultaneously. We must build a clean and healthy world if future generations are to thrive. And my last slide, a quote from Lord of the Rings: "We don't choose the times we live in. The only choice we have is how to respond." And I will end with that and stop sharing, and happy to take questions.
Wow. Thank you, Chip. I'm going through the questions just in order. Karthik has a question right at the beginning about forecasts on energy deployments to meet AI data center needs. Uh, and how do we kind of understand? How do you frame that in your mind about what's going on there?
I think nuclear energy needs to be on the table. They are starting to look at nuclear for some data centers. The huge problem there is pollution, of course, and how do we dispose of nuclear waste? It's very dangerous. In lieu of that, I think it's an opportunity to expand our use of clean energy in massive quantities. AI data centers are the coming reality. It's actually here, it's arrived. And there's a huge amount of money and investment associated with that. We need our leaders in the AI data center space to focus their wealth on sustainably powering these data centers. I don't prefer nuclear, but perhaps it's a short-term intermediate bridge until we can build much larger forms of renewable energy.
Chip, another question was about the leaf death spiral. And I think you mentioned that this is not yet accounted in various climate models. Just wanted to clarify that.
It's accounted in climate models, but it's not accounted for by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So every party, about 200 nations, have agreed to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And the calculations that go into this are ignoring the fact that we're losing that sequestration by photosynthesis. So the UN FCCC calculations are an underestimate of how quickly we're moving towards these temperature goals.
And there's a related question, which is about, again, if a lot of ecosystems are operating at their thermal thresholds, then do the current carbon offsetting schemes take that into account?
No, they do not. It's very poorly known. And it's an example, one of many, where the media have failed us. You can find little corners of media keeping track of this stuff, but our typical mainstream media is not keeping up the drumbeat of news. So most of us are unaware of these global scale issues.
Another interesting question is India is the party to Paris Convention and yet decided to add 80 gigawatts of coal-based thermal plants in the next 5 to 7 years. Your comments on this?
I think that the current federal administration in the United States have tacitly given permission for this. On the one hand, India is working very hard to increase the public health, education, transportation systems in that nation. They are working hard to modernize. But I think that the Trump administration has given global permission through its activities to behave in this way, to invest in more greenhouse gas generation. An ideal world would be the United States military putting on a tool belt and deploying across the planet to the developing nations as a construction force and building renewable energy. But that is very unlikely to happen.
Varsha has a question that Chip, you and I were discussing right before the call, which is the memo that came out from Bill Gates 2 days ago, which warned against climate alarmism and the fact that the climate crisis won't cause humanity's demise, and therefore calling for us to shift focus on improving lives to prevent diseases and poverty. How how does that affect our ability to mobilize resources and maintain public trust in climate action when figures like Bill Gates uh, portray or position the issues in such ways?
Yeah, I was extremely disappointed in Bill Gates' position. There's no need to counterbalance human suffering and greenhouse gas emissions. We can focus on both. And in fact, allowing for increased greenhouse gas emissions causes increased human suffering. So I just don't know what he was thinking. Somebody must have gotten to him. You would think that one of the richest men in the world, people in the world, would be untouchable, but apparently his thinking has gotten so contaminated and so myopic. This is why I wrote this paper last year, and I encourage all of you to read this paper. It's open access. Just Google Earth at Risk, and you should get to it. In the last 12 months, it's already been cited over 110 times in other papers. And I'm turning that paper into a book, by the way, called The Reckoning, and I'm working through the chapters on that.
Chip, there's a question from Yana towards the end, which is which country or region would be a good example of tackling climate change?
Let's see. The EU is doing a good job. They are still on track to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. They, however, are failing in terms of helping other nations with the problem. The European Union, the United States, Canada, and other developed nations caused potentially irreversible damage to the rest of the world during the era of colonialism. And we are still trying to crawl our way out of that ditch. The social, emotional, and political ramifications of that era still reverberate today. There is still colonialism in many forms. There's commercial colonialism. The meat industry is engaging in colonialism of its type. It has a business model of commercializing low-income communities, and that includes low-income nations. If you go into a low-income community anywhere in the United States, you find rows and rows of fast food restaurants because it's always possible to have $10 to feed your family a cheeseburger. And they're finding their way. They have now found their way throughout Africa, throughout Central America. So that's a form of colonialism as well. They've colonized the food system. All of these issues are well written about. My paper is not the first by any means, but they are still not considered mainstream schools of thought, however. It's sad. And that's why it's important for each and every one of you to make sure that you have a daily news feed that reveals the truth. There are multiple climate change news organizations and social justice organizations. This is how you should be receiving your news so that you're made more and more conversant with these issues. And you're constantly reminded that these are the real issues that humanity faces.
I think one thing I can plug is that on Blue Sky, there are actually a lot more, that concentration of people who are kind of thinking about it from a very scientific and from a social justice standpoint, that concentration is much higher than most other places. So if you haven't seen that, maybe that's one place to go. I think we have time for one last question, which is from Choria. And his question is, I always have this doubt in my mind, if we reduce our CO2 emissions, will we be able to reduce climate change effects by being sure of Earth's non-anthropogenic CO2 levels? I'm asking this question to a certain fundamental mentality, whether to prioritize climate change adaptation over climate change mitigation at this stage.
We have to do both. I'm sorry, the problem has become more difficult, but we have to do both. And I'm going to tell you, even as we reduce our CO2 emissions, the ocean is going to release dissolved CO2. So it will be decades before we see any actual difference in the growth rate of CO2 in the air. The oceans have dissolved so much heat and so much CO2 that they are going to become a source when we stop being the leading source. The planet is way out of equilibrium. If you think about thermodynamics, the planet has been thrown way out of equilibrium, and all of these ecological systems and storage systems have to come back into equilibrium. And so adaptation is critically important, and cutting our emissions as fast as possible is critically important. They all have to be done.
Thank you, Chip. I know there's so many other questions, but and I know Chip's talk is always kind of a bit of a reminder of where we are without any layering of or softening the facts. And I think a lot of these questions that you have, they are part of our arc over the next 10 weeks. So please do hold on to them. And these are great questions to bring to your lab as well. So once again, please join me in thanking Chip for taking the time out of his busy day for talking to all of us and sharing his incredible wisdom. Thank you, Chip.
Thank you, everybody. You're doing the right thing. I'm proud of all of you for being part of this group. Take care.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.